Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma la sahla illa ma ja'altuhu sahla wa anta taj'alul hazna idha shi'ta sahla. Dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's my absolute pleasure and honor here to be addressing you in the wonderful town, or was it a city, I can't remember, of Bolton. I think the last time I spoke here would have been about at least a decade ago. I'm going to begin by quoting the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who said, "Bada al-Islamu ghariba wa sayaudu ghariban kama bada, fatuba lil ghuraba." That the Islam began as something strange, as a stranger, and will return as a stranger. So glad tidings to you, O strangers. And in this world today, as you can see, the Muslims, even though we form approximately, depending on statistics that you follow, either a quarter or a fifth of the world's global population. So though we may be seen to be a minority here, we are a majority elsewhere, and we are a large minority. And despite us being a minority, we are treated, in the famous words apparently of Nelson Mandela, you can judge a society on how it treats its minorities. And how we can see our minorities, us as a minority, how we've been treated over the years, is telling. In the years of the war on terror until now, the rhetoric has always been about Muslim, the word Muslim connected to fanatics, connected to fundamentalists, connected to zealots, connected to extremists, and connected to terrorists. Ironically, it is, of course, that the most famous man on the planet today, living in recent memory, was a convicted terrorist called Nelson Mandela, who had an organization called Spears of the Nation that fought against apartheid South Africa with armed responses. Now, the Muslim community in this country and elsewhere has been at the receiving end of legislation. And it is that legislation that has allowed politicians and ordinary people on the street to feel that it's okay to be anti-Islamic, to be Islamophobic, to oppose the hijab, to oppose and speak about the niqab, as our Prime Minister, though it hurts the tongue to say it, Boris Johnson, has actually said of Muslim women in niqab that they look like letterboxes or bank robbers. It is okay for the most powerful man in the world, Donald Trump, to say that Islam hates us. It is okay for him to say that he believes waterboarding works, that torture works, even though it is a crime under international law. Even though in the context of war, using torture is a war crime. And the waterboarding techniques that were used on people that I know in Guantanamo Bay during World War II were regarded as war crimes when the Japanese carried them out against American soldiers. But when American soldiers carried them out against Muslim prisoners in 2001 and beyond, it's just called enhanced interrogation techniques. It's not even a crime. Nobody's prosecuted for it. They are all above the law. And Britain and America and Australia and Canada and New Zealand and all of these Five Eyes countries are supposed to be and claim to be countries that uphold the rights of the person, the individual, and the rule of law. But when it came to the war on terrorism that was launched as a result of 9/11, Guantanamo is still open. And not a single person out of the 800 prisoners that were held there, including myself, was ever successfully prosecuted for the reason why Guantanamo was opened, 9/11. Instead, they launched a war on terrorism, which they unaptly named, first of all, Operation Enduring Freedom. In fact, for us, it was Operation Ending Your Freedom, without charge or trial. People were detained in Bagram, in Kandahar, where I saw people beaten to death. I saw Muslims tied with their hands to the top of the cage, being punched and kicked repeatedly by American soldiers, and they said Allah, Allah on their breath 100 times while they were being kicked until they died as a result of blunt trauma to their legs. A war was launched where thousands of bombs, smart bombs, vacuum bombs, cluster bombs bullets and rounds of ammunition, ordnance, Moab bombs which weighed 15,000 pounds, daisy cutters dropped on Afghanistan alone. Nobody bothered to count the number of the dead because the dead don't count. We know, tragically and horrifically, on September the 11th, 2,976 people died. We know to the single digit every single person, because every single person mattered. Every life mattered. And I'm asking, just in Afghanistan, in the wake of the War on Terror when it was launched, Operation Enduring Freedom, who even knows the number of dead? And why weren't they counted? Because they don't count. And then as a result of Afghanistan, what happened in Afghanistan, the invasion and the capturing of people, and taking them off to offshore sites, sadly that were hosted by Muslim countries, whether it was in the Emirates, whether it was Morocco, whether it was Jordan, whether it was Pakistan, whether it was Indonesia, whether it was Malay, whoever it was, whichever country it was, sites, black sites were set up where these offshore torture centers were used so that America could argue we didn't do this on our soil. America doesn't do this, we just simply do it on another country's soil. We carry out torture on another country's soil. And then they forced out extractions of confessions that were totally false, that suggested Saddam Hussein was working with Al-Qaeda. And when they took those confessions that they waterboarded and tortured and electrocuted out of people, they went to the United Nations Security Council and said, we have credible evidence that Saddam's working with Al-Qaeda. A complete falsehood. Anybody from that world knew Saddam never worked with Al-Qaeda and vice versa. It never happened. They used that information, presented to the United Nations Security Council, and that became the evidence for the invasion of Iraq. The rest, as you know, is history. The reasons why anti-terror legislation is passed in this country, one after the other, is because of that tortured testimony. Because of that torture. Because if that invasion never happened, Iraq wouldn't have fallen apart. ISIS would never have come about. And there's been not a single person, not Blair, not Cameron, not May, not Johnson, nobody, left or right, Labour or Conservative, who's faced a jury for being involved in these crimes against humanity. Not a single one of them. Not Bush, not Obama, and certainly not Trump. All of these politicians have come and gone, but the legacy of their war and their language remains, and it increases. It's building up as we see. Britain is a great land of laws and poetry and literature and words and freedoms. Yet you've seen law after law passed in this country since 2000 that is effectively legislated against poetry, against literature. People convicted in the land of Shakespeare and Wordsworth for writing poetry because it's Muslim poetry that praises fighters in Afghanistan or Iraq. Books published here that were originally written by 7th or 8th or 9th century Islamic scholars, people prosecuted and thrown into prison for being involved in their publications. In Britain, the land of books, the land of literature, the land of education. All of this stuff is stuff that we've seen as Cage, as my organization, my colleagues, constantly interviewing people, talking to people affected by this legislation. And if that wasn't enough, people were placed under house arrest in Britain. Most of you probably don't know that house arrest actually exists in Britain. But it does, because most of those people who were subjected to that under the control order scheme used to come to Cage. And we used to document how they were placed under house arrest in Britain, not Burma, based upon secret evidence. Evidence that you could not see. You couldn't challenge it. You didn't know what it was that your accuser was accusing you of. You couldn't go to court and say and defend yourself because there was no accusation. There was no court. Just as when we were held in Guantanamo, not by the Chinese government, who are doing what they're doing to our brothers and sisters in East Turkestan, not by the Burmese government, who are doing to what they are doing to our brothers in the Rakhine state, not by the Israelis, not by the Indians, but by Britain and America, who all sign up to habeas corpus and Magna Carta and to the rights of the person, and that nobody shall be detained without charge or trial, except that they'll be judged by a court of their peers. Nobody shall be subjected to torture. Nobody shall be subjected to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. These are the countries that sign up to this, that actually tell the rest of the world that we are better than you, more civilized than you, because we have these laws and rights that protect against even the worst in society. Yet in reality, scratch the surface and you'll find Britain's role as complicit in the torture of its own citizens has happened not now but in the past. America's role in not only torturing its own citizens, but actually extrajudicially, without any legal processes, killing them in places like Yemen, in places like Afghanistan, in places like Somalia and Libya and Syria, and the list goes on and on. Common denominator. Each one of these places is part of the Muslim world. What does that tell you? When Brenton Tarrant walked into the masjid in Christchurch and opened fire on children as young as 3, on old people who ran into the corner, into their masjid on a Jum'ah, when he opened fire and live broadcast that feed across the world, you know what he was listening to? You know what he was listening to in his ears? He was listening to Serbian nationalist radical music that praised Radovan Karadzic, who was in charge of the Bosnian Serbs and the massacre that took place of the Muslims in Srebrenica. 8,000 Muslim young men and boys. The biggest massacre in Europe since the Holocaust of Muslims. And you know what he said in his manifesto? He praised the far right. Of course he did. He wrote about historic clashes between Islam and the West, because he saw himself as a crusader. But the oddest thing that he also did was that he praised the Chinese government. He praised the Chinese Communist government, this guy from the far right, ideologically and politically opposed to communism, praises the Communist government of China for one reason alone: because of how it treats its Muslim population, how it puts them into concentration camps, how it tries to divest of them their Islamic belief, how they try to force them to drink alcohol, to eat pork, to renounce Islam, to memorize the Communist Party manifesto as a creedal belief. And a person like that exists today that marries together both the left and the right when it comes to a view of Islam. And that is why I began with the hadith, Bada al-Islamu ghariban. It's strange to those people on either side that Muslims would hold on to their faith. That Muslims would hold on to their faith like hot coals at this time, like Rasulullah ﷺ warned us of. And one of the things that's happened repeatedly, if you see, whether it is the ignorant person on the street, and for the person on the street, I can say they're ignorant, and that ignorance is easily fixed. It's easily changed by a little bit of knowledge, and a little bit of good manners, and a little bit of interaction. That's easy to do. The harder part is with our politicians, entrenched, who know exactly what it is that they're doing, pitting people against us. And it is those people who have allowed the systematic and institutional Islamophobia that exists today. Just as we saw before in the past with the black community, that racism was found to be institutional as a result of the Stephen Lawrence case. We know now, and from my colleagues you will hear, the reasons why Islamophobia is institutional. It's not just on the street. In fact, the street wouldn't do it if the institutions of power hadn't enabled them to do so. And it starts from the very top. The targeting of Muslims across the board has been systematic, and part of the response for us as Cage is to say enough. We've had enough. You cannot torture us, detain us without trial, abuse our faith, abuse us as people, abuse our conscience and our ability to be human beings without us standing up. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran very simply, لا تظلمون ولا تظلمون. Do not oppress, never be an oppressor, and do not be oppressed. In relation to oppression, the Prophet ﷺ said, Unsur akhuka zaliman o madluma. Help your brother, and this is how the Prophet ﷺ saw help. Help your brother, whether he is an oppressor or from amongst the oppressed. The Sahaba responded by saying, we understand, Ya Rasulullah, how to stop. We would stop an oppressor. But how do we help our brother if he's an oppressor? And he said, by staying his hand. Staying his hand. Stopping that oppression. And so for us, it's important that whilst its oppression reigns upon us and falls upon us every single day that we see, through the media and through the politicians and on the streets and in the workplace and in the schools and in the places of education, through the Prevent program, through Schedule 7, through the MI5 targeting in us, being stopped where we come and go, our very existence being questioned. This, my dear brothers and sisters, is the time to stand. And I'm going to end with one story until my brothers, inshallah, will go on to more about what Cage is about. I've repeated this story several times and I'll repeat it again, not to feel proud for myself, but to remind you that in the worst and the most difficult of times, it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who gives you your direction. He says, أَمْ حَسِبْتُمْ أَن تَدْخُلُوا الْجَنَّةَ وَلَمَّا يَأْتِكُمْ مَثَلُ الَّذِينَ خَلَوْا مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ مَأْسَأْتُهُمُ الْبَأْسَاءُ وَالضَّرَّاءُ وَالزُّلْزِلُوا حَتَّى يَقُولُ الرَّسُولُ وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مَعَهُ مَتَى نَصْرُ اللَّهِ أَلَا إِنَّ نَصْرَ اللَّهِ قَرِيبٌ. Do you consider that you will enter Jannah and you will not be tested in the way that those people who came before you were tested? They were tested with hardships and difficulties until the earth under their feet of the Prophet and those who believed with him shook, and they said, oh, when will the help of Allah come? And he replies that the help of Allah is close. When I was held by the Americans and taken into custody, the first place they took us into was not actually a prison. They took us onto an airplane. They'd stripped the brothers naked. They'd sliced off their clothes with a knife. They shaved our beards till I saw brothers who'd had beards, older brothers, white beards, crying like babies. Not because they'd been punched or kicked. Some of these brothers had lost their legs fighting against the Soviet Union. They weren't afraid of a physical damage, but it was the pain they felt for their religious identity being sheared off like a sheep. And in the midst of this, after this, they took us onto this airplane, forced us into this bowing position, into the ruku position, forced soldiers, huge, big, giant soldiers, American soldiers, armed with M16s and Glock pistols, arm behind the back, one here, pushed into the bowing position, chains on our legs, chains on our hands, hoods on our heads, dragged onto this aircraft, designed through shock and awe to terrify us. Dogs barking, guns pointed at us, being rounded, a chamber being rounded. All of this noise, the sound of the engines, the fear, what's going to happen next? Are they going to kill me? Am I going to see my family again? What about Umama? What about Abdurrahman? What about Nusayba, my little daughters and brother and children? Am I going to see them ever again? Are they now just a memory in my head? And in the midst of all that, I'm seated onto the ground, tied like cargo onto the airplane. And a brother says, Akhi, salamu alaykum. I say, wa alaykum salam. He said, Hal sallayta salat al-maghrib? Did you pray salat al-maghrib? And I'm thinking, subhanallah, I'm thinking about life or death, but he's thinking about, what's he thinking about? Inna salata kanat ala al-mu'minina kitaban mawquta. That the salah was prescribed at its fixed times. That's what he's thinking about at a time like this. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has protected this deen, this ummah, from people like that. And he said, Akhi, we should pray now. دخل وقت الصلاة لابد أن نصلي. And that's how I prayed my first prayer in American custody. With that man next to me, a Libyan, hands behind his back, hood over his head, shackles over his legs, strap over his legs, guns pointed towards us, knives pointed out. That's how we prayed in American custody. And that's the message that Cage wants to give you. That no matter what happens, this deen will be protected with you or without you. حجة لك أو حجة عليك. جزاكم الله خير. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.